Some say they came to this land from the Yucatan, or eastward and northward across the Great Valley of Mexico. Others say they followed the rivers down from the forests and mountains to the north. But there is evidence that people dwelled on these shores for millennia, thousands of years before the pharaohs or the first faint stirrings of recorded human history. For 12,000 years, they lived and loved, dreamed and died along the rivers and shores and mangrove isles of what we now know as Florida. What they called themselves is largely lost, but others who came later called them such names as Calusa and Apalachee, Tequesta and Timucua. Over the ages, they created cultures of rare beauty and vitality. By AD 1500, it is believed that between 100,000 and 1 million people lived in Florida. In slightly more than 200 years, they were all and each gone from the earth forever. They were cut down by the cruel blades and diseases of the Spanish, some by later raids from the British colonies to the north. And none remain to tell us how they fare. Ted Morris is an artist. For a professional lifetime, he has pursued the lost people of Florida, seeking to bring them alive again with his art. But how can the artist depict the lives of people no living person has ever seen?
The first thing I do when I start a painting is I'll do a lot of historical research, read books, and I'll contact archaeologists that are familiar with that culture that I'm working on. And they will give me a lot of feedback as far as artifacts and what they know about the culture. At that point, I like to go out into the actual field and see where they lived and see the wildlife and the plants and just kind of get a feel of what it was like to live there and just try to transport myself back.
To find the world of Florida's lost people requires a journey back through both time and space.
We're coming now to the Page Ladson site, the richest early records of the first Floridians. 12,000 years ago, when that was being deposited, there was no river here. Instead, there was just the sinkhole pond, perhaps 6 feet deep. People, mammoths, lots of other megafauna would come to that watering hole, and it was probably one of the few in the whole area.
The great changes in Florida's landscape make it especially difficult for the artist to reflect what it must have been like in the time when Paleo-Indians dwelled here. What he sees now is often not the world the ancients saw. To properly depict their lives, he must go beyond the evidence of his eyes to the evidence found beneath the surface of the river.
We were quite amazed to discover that there really was a stack of sediments all the way from 30 feet to shallows, carrying, like the pages of a book, all the chapters, 5,000 years in 5 meters. And the preservation turns out to be fabulous, where you get wood, ivory, which is really very delicate, very fine features of the bones, and it's all preserved just really in the bottom of this site where it's sealed off from oxygen.
For both archaeologist and artist, the search for Florida's lost people requires a similar process. Both seek to create a picture of what life was like based on the clues the people left behind. The clues accrue, sometimes mislead, and often inspire different interpretations. In the case of the Aucilla River site, it would appear the people were mobile hunters who followed the mastodon in much the same way later Indians in other areas followed the buffalo.
In order to get back to the 12,000-year-old chapter here in this part of the river, we're working at about 30 to 35 feet. And that's the time when 12,000 or more years ago, This was a very tiny watering hole in a very arid landscape. And this is where we've picked up lots of big bones, cut tusk material, and the early lithic evidence of these Paleo-Indians or the first Floridian cultures.
The archaeologist brings spear points and mastodon bones to the surface of the river. But he brings more than stone and bone. He also brings an echo of that distant struggle between hunters and the beast. A vivid reminder of what it must have been like to face the mastodon with only a spear and a small stone point. What do we see reflected in the hunter's eyes? A capacity for courage, fear, wonder, a determination to survive. Sometimes, when you listen to the stone, you can hear the heartbeat. Now the artist faces a new challenge. He reaches into the past for individuals who lived among the Calusa, a powerful and remarkably creative people who dwelled on the lower Florida Gulf Coast. In the past, he had painted several canvases of the Calusa, and with each painting, he tried to capture something of the spirit that created the beautiful works they left behind. In preparation for this new painting, Morris visited the mangrove isles and estuaries of the Calusa, a world of bays and islands that was once the home of a remarkably rich and complex culture.
This is a really common feature in most Calusa sites. This is one of the canals that leads from the sound out there from where we came in back into the center part of the site. And the Calusa were entirely a water people. What's unusual about the Calusa is they were a non-agricultural people. They were primarily hunter-gatherer fishers. But what makes them unusual is that they were a highly stratified society. The chief controlled the workings of the stars and the weather. He also had a political chief who helped him organize the different other tribes who paid tribute. Some of the tribes as far away as Miami and the Keys paid tribute to the Calusa. They controlled the whole southern two-thirds of the Florida Peninsula.
Many archaeologists believe the Calusa capital was here at Mound Key in the waters of Estero Bay.
This is the highest mound on the island. It's also the highest Indian mound in the region, and it's the high point in the county at 30 feet. When you look at the structure of Calusa sites, the arrangement of the topographic features is similar. The cross-cutting canal, typically going from southwest to northeast, the two big frontal mounds. This is a really common layout. If we were to apply Mississippian models to our understanding of the geography, we would probably conclude that the highest mound is where the chief lived. This magnificent black mangrove forest, of course, wouldn't have been here when the Calusa were here. This would have been probably an open water court, and they could have come in, and this connects to the central canal, and they could have brought their canoes in and parked them in this area. And if the scenario is correct, then you could imagine perhaps them drying nets on these ridges out around, perhaps some houses out on platforms. Also, we found a number of hammers, shell hammers along the backside. So perhaps this was an area where they were opening up some of their shellfish, or tenderizing some of their conch, or maybe even making other shell tools, perhaps even doing some carving back in this area. But certainly this would have been a central area, a central plaza, functioned much in the same way as a downtown green does in our colonial villages or in our towns today.
The liquid whisper of Calusa canoes, fishermen returning, nets drying, the aroma of cook fires, children playing in the dying day. All this the artist imagines in the shadows and reflections of a mangrove forest. Back in his studio, the artist transfers his Calusa sketches to canvas. He begins to rough in a composition. But soon he must come to grips with the central figures of the painting, the people themselves. The canvas hungers for their image. Sometimes the inspiration for the central figures in his paintings comes from unexpected sources. As in the case of the Birdman Dancer, a very real human being who once lived and danced on the outskirts of what is now Tallahassee. The Birdman Dancer was a warrior who lived among the Appalachian people on the shores of Lake Jackson. Here, in the shadow of the Florida state capitol, dwelled one of the last and grandest of Florida's lost people.
They were very populous people, numbering 40,000. They lived in an area between the Ocklawaha River west of Tallahassee to the Osceola River east of Tallahassee, and from the Gulf of Mexico to some unknown extent into South Georgia. They inhabited the red clay hills of North Florida. They were farmers and therefore the most populous, apparently because they were able to maintain a fairly sophisticated level of society, which allowed a ranked chiefdom system of which they could build communities and mounds and have ceremonial centers and perpetuate those through time. Lake Jackson site, for example, in Tallahassee, is their main center that we know of.
The copper breastplate bearing the image of a dancer was found in a Lake Jackson temple mound. Here were buried the elite of society. And buried with them were high-status artifacts, copper, mica, beads, and exotic stones. Copper was apparently obtained by trade with tribes to the north. The copper breastplate that inspired the artist's painting was found in the tomb of a woman, one of 9 generations of leaders entombed within the temple complex. The dancer's ceremonial garb, based on the artifacts found at the Lake Jackson site, may be rich in authentic detail. But what of the man, the person, the human being behind the mask? There are a few self-portraits Florida's lost people left behind. Shadowy snapshots on stone, wood, or clay. But these images are more evocative than descriptive, and do not satisfy the artist's need to see the people as they were, whole and real and alive. In the 16th century, when Europeans came to Florida, they recorded in prose and picture the people they encountered. One artist, the Frenchman Jacques Lemoyne, actually sketched them from life. It would seem that these accounts and images would be rich material for the contemporary artist. But the Lemoyne drawings are distant and impersonal. They are highly stylized and seem to hold the people at arm's length. What did Florida's lost people look like? At the Museum of Florida History in Tallahassee, a team of scientists and scholars attempted to find an answer. The team was charged with creating lifelike mannequins of human beings no living soul had ever seen.
It's not an easy process. There's no one right answer. We brought in people from a number of different disciplines around the state. We brought archaeologists into the process. We brought Native Americans into the process. Various researchers. We tried to pool the best knowledge. And what we found was there's no one answer that everyone agrees on with. Even looking at one facial reconstruction, it's one thin window on what people may have looked like. People are as different as you and I. And so to look at one facial reconstruction and say, this is what Indians looked like at the time, is lunacy. We all know that that's not correct, but we have so little to go on. It points us in the right direction. That a narrower, longer face was something we saw as a general characteristic. Slight dip to the nose, slight hawkishness to the nose. There were the darker skin that we think was probable from descriptions and from some present-day Indians. And I think in the end we came up with something that's pretty good.
Just what Florida's first people looked like has fascinated physical anthropologists for years.
Bone, in fact, does have a fairly interesting story to tell. We have become very good at teasing a lot of information out of human skeletal material. In fact, one of the things that we can do better now than we ever could before is look at some skeletal material and make assessments of how tall was that person when they were alive. And one of the things that the people have looked at with respect to Florida skeletal material, Florida prehistoric material particularly, is looking back and sort of assessing the French and the Spanish and some of the English accounts that Florida natives were very, very tall. In fact, they've been described as giants. And so we can take, simple dimensions of how long a femur is and then fit it into a mathematical equation and come up with some estimates. And what we see very consistently is that most New World populations, the males probably were averaging about 5'6" tall. Occasionally you'll find people who maybe push 5'9", but it's very unusual to see somebody that's much beyond that.
Where does truth dwell? How can we say this is the face of a Calusa and this is not? The artist examines the faces of Native Americans. There is an enormous range of facial and body types, not only between cultural groups, but within groups, even within families. Science can provide a basic idea, but ultimately, the answer can only be found within the corridors of the imagination. There's one thing known for certain about people and their appearance. All cultures throughout human history have sought to change or enhance their appearance with the materials at hand. Body and facial ornamentation was for religious purposes, for determining rank or status, or as in the case of the Timucuans, the distinctive eagle headdress was an important part of preparation for war. The proud and warlike Timucuans lived far to the north of the domain of the Calusa. They dwelled among the marshes and forested bluffs of the lower St. Johns River and by the estuaries and waterways of Florida's eastern seaboard.
A great deal of what we know about the Native Americans of this area, the Timucuan and their prehistoric antecedents, is based largely on the archaeological record, that information that we extract from archaeological sites. It tells us a great deal about prehistoric diet and the way that they lived and their lifestyle and the tools that they used. But as far as knowing more about their actual decoration and ornamentation and the manner in which they dressed, we have to rely largely on ethnographic accounts, early historical accounts by Europeans who made contact with the New World in the 16th century. These ethnographic accounts provide us with some insights, rare insights, into the way these people looked. The Timucuan were a highly ornate people. They enjoyed decorating themselves, especially those people who were more important, those of greater status, were tattooed, for example, from head to toe in striking colors, reds and blues, and lots of patterns and tattooing and dots and lines. So it must have been a very interesting sight indeed when the first Spanish saw these Native Americans, these Timucuans, emerging from the forest in these striking colors with these highly ornate headdresses and the rich blues and reds. It must have been an interesting cultural clash.
Personal adornment was in no way unique to the Timucuans. In his studio, the artist's vision for his Calusa painting begins to take shape. He wants to portray a scene in which knowledge or skill or experience is passed from one generation to another. But he struggles with the little girl in this work, trying to determine her role. Although the girl would probably not grow up to carve ceremonial masks, she would certainly work with clay, a skill just as significant to the spiritual life of the people as the skill of the carver. Morris had tried to capture this spiritual role in a previous painting of a Tequesta woman. He had called the painting Woman of the Sacred Clay, and she lived far to the south in the realm of a very special people.
The Tequesta lived in southeastern Florida at a time that ranged approximately from about circa 500 BC up until the time of Spanish contact. Now, these were people who were basically very well adapted to the natural environment. That is, that they were expert fishermen. If they couldn't get there by canoe, they probably didn't go. Therefore, consequently, there are many, many sites distributed along the waterways that connect from Biscayne Bay all the way to the interior Everglades. We're situated now at a location at the mouth of the Miami River, and this was the main town, the main village of the Tequesta Indians, and certainly this is the place where the largest amount of prehistoric assemblage of materials have been found. Even though we're in the shadow, in the midst of tremendous development, the men of the Tequesta culture were basically involved in fishing. The women were the master ceramicists, they were the potters, and what characterized Tequesta material culture and this distinguished it from other Native American cultures in southern Florida was the fact that they had really developed a very sophisticated, very interesting style of pottery.
In a way, the women of the lost people of Florida have become the storytellers of their people. Based on ethnographic and historical evidence, many archaeologists believe women were the potters. The ceramics they fashioned provide the clues that tell us who they were and how they lived. It is largely through the women of the sacred clay that the Tequesta, the Timucuans, the Apalachee, and the Calusa live on through time.
Obviously, people were using ceramic artifacts for a number of different reasons. And one reason was probably utilitarian, and making bowls to eat food out of and gather food and that sort of thing. And the other was for the sacred, perhaps, to accompany people to the grave. And that's been the object of probably of more study. And also the sacred ceramics are more exciting than the mundane, everyday ceramics, which tend to be very plain and that sort of thing. You get the greatest art styles, for instance, in the sacred pottery, and sometimes even better technology, and some very exciting pieces made into animal shapes. And I don't think that we really know exactly what all of those things mean yet in Florida. Ceramics are useful to the archaeologist probably more than any other material, particularly because they're so durable. And because clays are plastic materials, they can be shaped into any manner of forms and decorated in any way that they want. And so even though they break through time, they tend to leave a record. And people that are experts in pottery analysis can just simply look at a piece of pottery, a sherd, a broken little teeny piece, and can tell you almost to the century when it was made and by which people.
Back in the artist's studio, there is an incomplete painting on the easel. A Calusa man and child hang suspended between canvas and the dark. Like the Tequesta beneath Miami, access to their world is blocked not by clustered condominiums, but by a pyramid of years. And there is something missing. The archaeologists, anthropologists, and archivists have brought the artist close, but there is some critical quality of the Calusa he has failed to recapture.
I went back to Mount Key. I'm not sure what I expected to find there that I had missed before, but I thought if I could just go back for a while and open myself up to it, then maybe something would present itself to me to help me finish the painting.
A Jesuit priest who lived among the Calusa wrote that they believed the soul resided in 3 places: in the shadow, in the reflection, and in the light dwelling within the eye. And this is what the artist hoped to find. He had searched for the physical form of the Calusa. Now he hopes to recover something of their soul. Can the artist or the archaeologist bring Florida's lost people back from their world to ours? Those distant wanderers who were so much more like us than we imagine. Lives of immense value. People who breathed and bled, dreamed and loved, created beauty, feared the coming of the night. Can the artist bring these lost wanderers back? Perhaps he can. But who is to say they are not here with us now and have been all along, silent companions to accompany our own journey through time? Chaos Productions Incorporated.